And I said, didn't you see he had a gun? She said, yes. I said, weren't you scared? She said, yes. And she said something to me that stuck in my head, which was, she said, I was scared, but just because you're scared doesn't mean you do nothing.
From the Harvard Kenneth C. Griffin Graduate School of Arts and Sciences, this is Colloquy, bringing knowledge from the university's PhD community to top-of-mind issues. I'm Paul Massari. Our guest today, an expert on leadership, strategy, and organizational growth, has thought a lot about courage. It's not fearlessness, he writes in his new book, How to Be Bold, but the ability to make sense of situations in helpful ways and also see ourselves as strong, capable people who can control our destinies. Most of all, he says that courage is a learned behavior, and he's here to put us on the path to developing a courageous mindset. Ranjay Gulati is the Paul R. Lawrence MBA class of 1942 professor of business administration at Harvard Business School. Ranked as one of the top 10 most cited scholars in economics and business over a decade by ISI Insight, Gulati has been a Harvard MacArthur Fellow and a Sloan Foundation Fellow. His research has been published in leading journals such as Harvard Business Review, American Journal of Sociology, and Organization Science. He's also written for the Wall Street Journal, Forbes, Strategy in Business, and the Financial Times. Professor Gulati received his PhD in organizational behavior from Harvard Griffin GSAS in 1993. Ranjay Gulati, welcome to Colloquy.
Thank you so much. Pleasure to be here with you today.
Thanks. So, when you were a teenager, this is how your book begins, your mother bought a piece of land that suddenly became very valuable. A developer wanted it. She told him it wasn't for sale. I wonder if you could describe what happened next.
You know, the story actually was one I had tried to forget because as you will discover, you'll see why I wanted to forget this story. And it was buried deep in the recesses of my brain. So I was home from boarding school one weekend and a gentleman came to the gate and my mother had a security guard at the gate who came to me and said, somebody's insisting on seeing your mom. It's the weekend and she doesn't usually see guests. Can you talk to him? So I went up to the gentleman. He was from the developer and he was insisting on seeing my mom. And I said, look, she's not going to see you. She doesn't want to sell the land. I knew about this. He said, could you tell her that we have been bothering her? I know. This is the last time we'll ever come. 5 minutes. That's all we want. Just 5 minutes, the last chance. So I went to my mom and she said, okay, bring him in, but you stand at the door and you keep a time. And 5 minutes, you take him out. So I brought him in. He was very respectful, big-built, burly gentleman in a blazer. He sat down opposite my mom in the living room on a sofa seat. And immediately he took out from his pocket a blank check, signed check, and a piece of paper and said, ma'am, we're not here to negotiate. We just want the land and you write in the amount, whatever you want. And my mom said, look, there is no more land for sale in that part of town. And that's exactly where I want to be. I want to have a design studio there so there's enough space for me. I don't care about the money. It's not about the money. I don't want to sell. And so I'm sorry. And so immediately his demeanor changes from polite to aggressive. And he says, I am not leaving here till you sign this paper. So my mother says, excuse me, please leave now. And at this point, he leans back in his sofa seat and his blazer, which is, sitting facing forward, he pulls it back. And he shows to both me and my mom a gun tucked in his waist. Very deliberately. He's trying to show us that he has a gun. I'm at the door. I'm frozen. I'm thinking, what should I do? Should I call the guard? Should I call the cook? Should I jump on the guy? Maybe he's bluffing. Maybe it's a fake gun. Maybe it's empty. Maybe I should wait. Maybe it's premature for me to get into a fight with him. What will happen next? I'm just thinking through all the scenarios if I can. My mother immediately, without hesitation, 5'1" tall, leaps out of her sofa seat, walks around the table and slaps him across the face. And she says, how dare you come into my house? First you try to bully me and now you try to threaten me to take away my land. Get out of here now. Now, he is rattled because the security guard hears the commotion. He comes running in. Her cook comes in from the kitchen, and he is now surrounded by people, and he runs out of there, leaving his checkbook behind. Now, after this is over, I asked my mom, I said, Mom, that was crazy. She says, why? And I said, didn't you see he had a gun? She said, yes. I said, weren't you scared? She said, yes. And she said something to me that stuck in my head, which was, she said, I was scared, but just because you're scared doesn't mean you do nothing. Just because you're scared doesn't mean you do nothing. Now, I was a little ashamed of myself because I was 14. By then, I was already feeling like I was a man. I should be protecting my mother. I felt I had really failed over there. So I tried to bury the story. I never thought about it, never talked about it. But it was there in the back of my mind that why are some people like her able to resource themselves in a moment of uncertainty, which naturally leads to fear, and are somehow able to transcend that fear and take action, while others are typically frozen, like I was. And it took me a long time to understand that. And there's some really great social science research that helps us understand some of these behaviors.
But the title of your book is How to Be Bold. So that made me wonder, first of all, how do you define boldness? And second of all, is it the same as courage?
I'm glad to clarify there are so many words we use to kind of capture this phenomenon. So let me describe the phenomenon, define the phenomenon first, and then we can think about what words fit. To my mind, first of all, unlike how I thought about it, not even others, I thought about it. I always thought of courage or guts or being bold as the absence of fear. Because I was a avid consumer of fiction, of Hollywood movies and Bollywood movies. When is the last time you saw James Bond saying, I'm scared to get out of this plane without a parachute, but I'm going to do it anyway? Right? There's never an admission of fear. In fact, if anything, they look confident and carefree. Or you think about Rambo or Terminator or Ethan Hunt or Jason Bourne or Clint Eastwood in a Wild West movie. These characters always present the cool as a cucumber, unfazed by what's happening around you. And never an admission of fear, because fear is a sign of weakness. It's an admission of that I'm not capable. And Nelson Mandela said it really well when he said, courage is not the absence of fear, it's resourcing yourself in the face of fear. And usually towards a noble cause. And that's how I define courage and boldness, which I would treat as synonymous in my book. Now, we can think about that in different ways. But in my mind, it's taking action in the face of fear towards a noble cause. Now, what's a noble cause is debatable. Noble for one is not noble for another. And that's where I tried to be as value neutral as I could. I wanted to focus on courage, not on some other larger debate.
Right. You have this formula for becoming more courageous, the 9 C's. I'd love us first to just talk about those a little bit and how they're grounded in the social science. And then maybe we can talk about some of the case studies in the book and how they exemplify this sort of formula.
Yeah. So the first 6 of those chapters where I talk about the C's, it was mostly to try to make it memorable in some way or the other, individual trust. The last 3 are about organizational trust. I mean, I study organizations, so I had to have something about organizations and courage of organizations as well. But the first 6 are really about individual trust. Now, a quick preamble as I get into the C's is that it's important to understand that courage is action in the face of fear. So fear is a very important construct in this story because what you're doing is taking action in spite of fear, right? Now, for thousands of years, human beings have prayed to a higher power to calm themselves down, to reduce the sense of fear. So you try to dampen your fear, or You do what the lion did in The Wizard of Oz, which is he took action in spite of fear. So I'll start with the first one. The first one is the one that really talks about dialing down the fear. How do I dampen my fear? I already mentioned for the longest time, humankind has prayed to a higher power, and it works. I interviewed some Ukrainian commandos operating behind enemy lines. Prayer, ritual is part of life over there, right? I also looked at what did Captain Sullenberger do. So what does Captain Sullenberger do? The first thing he does when he has to land the plane in the Hudson, he's decided that he makes a checklist. All pilots love checklists. Turns out checklists are a calming device. It's a way to dial down the emotional response because you're now focused on the task at hand, the list of things you must do. So it's a very powerful way for what is called emotional regulation. There's a body of research on emotional regulation which looks at such kinds of tactics, right? Modularizing and breaking it down is one of those things. The other thing people like to use is ritual. I mean, I didn't know this till I wrote this book, was Adele, the famous singer, is terrified of singing, public singing. So what does she do? She has a ritual. She looks at Celine Dion's picture before she sings. It's kind of her hero. It calms her down. Athletics is full of this, by the way. Katie Ledecky, famous swimmer, she recites her grandmother's name. It calms her down. So I mentioned to you rituals in Ukraine with these commandos who do rituals before they go off. So first one, the C is really emotional regulation, what I call calm. Right? Let's look at another one. Confidence. Now, this comes from research done by a Stanford professor named Albert Bandura. And Bandura, in some ways, I think, I would imagine, was trying to replicate what two British psychologists had done in World War II. Those two were studying perhaps the most dangerous occupation in the British Army at that time was paratroopers and bomb disposal squads. And they were trying to see how these soldiers stay calm. And it was classic kind of training and exposure therapy. The more they slowly in their training got exposed to the dangers, and as they got exposed to the dangers, they were numb to the dangers and they were able to deal with it. What airlines do with passengers who are terrified of flying, right? Your classic exposure therapy. So he recruited a number of students who were terrified of snakes. And he said, I'm going to make you look at pictures and slowly expose you to snakes. And over time, maybe you'll get comfortable with the snake and maybe you'll hold one. And he was going to make them hold a corn snake. These are huge snakes. They don't bite, but they look scary. And many students dropped out during the course of his study. But the ones who stuck around later not only said they could hold a snake, but it had given them this sense of confidence, general confidence, not about snakes. It was about in their life. It now meant that they were different in everything, all their other pursuits. If they could deal with a snake, they could deal with anything. And he called this work self-efficacy. I call it, since I had a C word, I had called it confidence. So I've talked about calm. I've talked about confidence with you. I'll share another one with you. This one actually is the hardest one to kind of explain, but I'll give it a shot. I call it conviction. Most of us hold on to some beliefs that are sacred to us. Meaning, if they are violated, we will do anything, even if at our own physical or emotional cost. Like protecting my family, right? Or some of us have some principles that are so dear to us that we will do anything to protect those principles. Alexei Navalny, gets poisoned in Russia as a dissident. He goes to Germany. He's evacuated to Germany, has a miraculous recovery, and, he's got a wife and 2 kids. And what does he do? He turns around, gets on a plane, goes back to Russia, knowing that they will arrest him and ship him to Siberia, which is exactly what they did. And he knew that he might die. But he said, I don't have a choice. So conviction becomes another piece of the puzzle. And there's actually, if you go back to Max Weber, the famous sociologist, said that, human behavior is triggered by 2 sentiments, if you will. One is a utilitarian sentiment, which is cost-benefit analysis. We kind of do the math. And the other one is what he calls interpretive. the meaning, attachment. And so we look at the world through a lens of meaning and identity. What does this mean for me, and what am I supposed to do? Even Captain Sullenberger, when he, in an interview afterwards, when Katie Couric asked him, he said, to me at that moment, it felt like my entire life up to that moment had been a preparation for handling that moment. So suddenly feeling that I have to do something, morally compelled, that's conviction. So that's a third C for you.
This is brilliant. And now I want to go back and watch the Tom Hanks movie about Sullenberger again. So let's talk about some of the individuals that you mention in the book. You say that these folks develop certain patterned ways of framing meaning. You just talked about conviction that made fear seem less palpable or even largely irrelevant. You also talk about the people who prevented the reactors from melting down during Japan's 2011 Fukushima nuclear disaster. Can you talk about how they embody this way of framing?
Yeah. And, linking it back to fear, what these people realize, I think that's what I learned, is they realize something else matters more than fear. Something else matters more than fear. So let's take the example of Fukushima that you asked. So what happens is in Fukushima, we all think of Fukushima as the Fukushima meltdown. That is the Fukushima Daiichi plant, which had a meltdown. It took global resources to contain that meltdown, and it'll take 25 odd years to clean it up. Right? So that's where we are. And it was because the boundary walls were 20 feet high, and water, nothing had ever happened that high, and the tsunami brought in 55-foot high water. What nobody talks about is the other nuclear complex 8 miles away, the Fukushima Daini plant, which had the same exact damage, had the same exact countdown. They had a finite amount of time to get the cooling system back up, or else they would have a meltdown too. And if they had a meltdown too, I don't think we had global resources to contain 2 simultaneous meltdowns in 2 complexes. And that would have been catastrophic. So what did Mr. Masuda do? He didn't know what to do, first of all. So he called headquarters. They said, we don't know what to do. Good luck. And so he puts out a whiteboard in the room, emergency room, a response room, where there are about 300 men over there. And they're terrified themselves because they can't reach their families who are living in the neighborhood. Cell towers are down. So, and they don't know what to do. So he puts up a whiteboard and he writes down, what do we know? And they write down, what do we know? We have cooling system shut, power lines down, sensors down, and we have X hours to get this thing back up or else meltdown. That's the facts. What do we need to know? Right? They make a list of what they would like to know. So then he asks for volunteers to go outside because they don't have anything. The feeds aren't working to give them the data they need. So volunteers who are willing to wear protective suits and go outside. So everybody raises their hand. He sends out a crew of 6. They go out, and good news, bad news, good news. The water levels have receded. So no longer flooded up place. But bad news, all power systems are off. Cooling systems are off. No power lines are working. Okay. Take stock. What do we do? Say, where do you think we might have power? Because we need to find power. Without power, we're toast. Absolutely. We can't do anything. They map out where power might be. Next round of volunteer units, off they go, and 1 unit comes back with live power. Now the question is, how are we going to, from there, create a little extension cord of sorts and connect it to the cooling systems for all the reactors? Where are we going to find the cables? They contact headquarters to heli-drop some cables. Then they send out teams to look for cables. And after every iteration, they're writing down on the board what they know and what they need to know. And step by step, then they have to figure out which reactors need the cooling system running first, because they are heating up at different speeds, different models. So then they prioritize which ones need to be turned on first. And one by one, they get every single reactor up in time with just hours to spare. Now, how does this relate to, I told you, social science research here? There's a very famous psychologist, org psychologist named Carl Weick, who studied firefighters and others and wrote about a concept called sense making. That in times of uncertainty and fear, what does a firefighter do? They don't have the luxury to wait outside the building and get information. They look at outside, they may form some hypotheses, and then they go in. As soon as they go in, they gather some more data, they revise their hypotheses, update, and then they go one more step in. And this iterative process, they work their way into the building. And what he calls acting your way into knowing. Sometimes you can't know before you act. You have to act your way into knowing. Now, you see this in entrepreneurship a lot. Entrepreneurs don't have all the data. And in today's world, if you look at the world of business or the world at large, do we know what's going to happen with AI? Do we know what's going to happen with geopolitics? Do we know what's going to happen with environment? We don't know. So freezing is not the right answer. Sometimes doing nothing is more risky than trying something and failing. So what I learned in this example was how they took action step by step and acted their way into knowing. There was also a moral conviction. They understood that really the survival of their families, but also really that whole island and a lot more hinged on them.
I'm wondering how, in a practical way, people can cultivate courage in their own lives. And in particular, how can we build our boldness muscles? And do courageous acts necessarily have to be life-risking and dramatic? I mean, do we have to be saving the island of Japan from a horrible meltdown?
It's a great question. You know, it's amazing. You, as an author, when you write a book, you start getting emails and LinkedIn messages from people you don't know. And one message I got from somebody really stuck in my head. This person said, you know, I have come to realize that most of us are living our fears, not our dreams. And it also dawned on me that fear is a primitive, paralyzing emotion. Our ancestors were cowards. They're the ones who survived. They ran for cover when there was a dangerous animal. They weren't running towards the animal. They were running away from the animal. So in some ways, cowardice is the default human response. Survival is hardwired in us. And so much of our actions, I look at myself, so many of my actions were probably driven, and I know were driven by fear. And if there's a way for us to transcend our fear, it really can be liberating and allow us to really think about things in a more objective way, because the fear hijacks the amygdala, the primitive brain. And how do we become more intentional? How do we become more deliberate? I think, there's a reason why many observers, including Aristotle and Maya Angelou and others, have described courage as the master virtue that unlocks all other virtues. That if you want to have any other virtues, you've got to start with courage to unlock the others. And I think there's some truth to that, you know, my thought here is that there are some very simple things. The science of calm. How do I calm myself down in the face of fear? Right? How do I build up my inner can-do mindset, my inner confidence that entrepreneurs, many of them seem to have? My mother had it for sure. Right? How do I learn to use comprehension as a tool? I'm not going to leap into the unknown. I'm going to take steps into the unknown. How do I build my own moral conviction? What do I believe in? What do I stand for? What are some things that are sacred to me? What's my purpose? Right? What are my values and beliefs? All these things create an arsenal or a toolkit which allows us to, be willing to take on fear rather than being paralyzed by fear. To me, that was the learning that I had in just seeing and listening to these stories.
You also wrote in the book, if there was ever a time to enhance our ability to control or manage fear and show more everyday courage, this is it. I'd love to ask you, why is boldness so important now? And where do you find it these days when you look around?
We're in an uncertainty crisis right now. We have a lot of uncertainty around us. In these times of uncertainty, it's really easy to get paralyzed. And I think this is precisely these moments when you have to say to yourself, like, okay, how do I deal with the fear I'm facing? And how do I take action? And it's not easy. And I have to tell you that, many of the examples of courage I gave seem to have come at no cost because the outcome was a good one, right? But some of them paid a price for this. I mean, Alexei Navalny died. So it's not always like a good ending. And I've now started, as a professor of business, I see in the business context, you see so many illustrations of companies that have, I teach an MBA class on business turnaround and transformation. Some of these companies are absolutely failing. I'll give you one from Boston here. It's a company called Boston Scientific. Boston Scientific in 2009 did what is considered to be the second worst acquisition in modern history, the worst being AOL Time Warner. Boston Scientific got into a bidding war and bought Guidant for a record sum of $28 billion, though they themselves are worth 27. So they buy a company, they think this is going to be their future growth, and it turns out to be a complete disaster. They have not only FDA recalls, there's all kinds of quality issues, there's all kinds of issues, regulatory issues with Guidant. The collective market cap drops to 8 billion, from 56 or 60 billion to 8 billion. They offer the job to a new CEO, Mike Mahoney. Mike hires a consulting firm to advise him on how bad is the situation and should he take the job. The consulting firm comes back and tells him it's really bad, it's unsalvageable, and you should not take this job. He takes it. And the whole case that I wrote, and I teach actually in 2 weeks, is about how Mike turned a failing company into a 8 billion market cap going down fast to a $150 billion market cap company, which is now in med devices considered the juggernaut. How do you do that? How do you get people bolstered up? Now, in business, they love sports language. So they call it the winning spirit, right? How do you create that winning spirit? So you see instances where, why would Mike take this job when he was told categorically, do not take it, right? But he still took it. And he faced down impossible odds. Or Anne Mulcahy, who became CEO of Xerox now many decades ago, almost bankrupt company, turns it around. So we have examples in business and outside business where leaders step up. And I think the world needs leaders like that.
From the Harvard Kenneth C. Griffin Graduate School of Arts and Sciences, this has been Colloquy. This podcast is an extension of the school magazine of the same name. You can find a transcript of the show, as well as past episodes, at the Harvard Griffin GSAS website, gsas.harvard.edu/colloquy-podcast. If you enjoyed this interview, please rate the show on Apple or Spotify, or like it on YouTube so that others can find it as well. And be sure to follow us on those channels so you'll never miss a conversation. Our theme music is from the Boston-based band Francine. I'm Paul Massari. See you next time.